Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Parmenius podcast with Bernard Wills. I'm your host, Jordan Shepard. Happy to be introducing the discussion today. We're recording from Grenfell Campus. So we'd first like to acknowledge, with respect, the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. Today we have our first in-person guest. We're really excited, special guest, Erica Samms-Hurley. I'm just going to give a quick introduction. Erica is a Mi'kmaq woman from the west coast of Newfoundland. She's worked as a nurse since 2004 in nursing education for over 15 years. Currently, she's an assistant professor with the Faculty of Nursing, Memorial University of Newfoundland, cross-appointed to the SASS at Grenfell Campus, which we can get into what that is. She's grounded in her cultural knowledge, which she draws upon for her work with various committees, locally, provincially, and nationally, which include the Institute Advisory Committee for Nutrition, Metabolism, and Diabetes for Canadian Institute of Health Research, Memorial University's President's Advisory Committee on Aboriginal Affairs, and a member of the Expert Advisory Committee on Population Health Data, StatCan. Erica is currently a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and her dissertation work is surrounding Mi'kmaq women and the heart, which we're going to get into. So with that, Erica, thanks for being on the podcast. Before we get into your work, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, sure. Great intro, by the way. It's basically, like Jordan said, I grew up on the West Coast. My parents are Jim and Gail Samms from Mount Moriah, but I'm connected to a community, my Mi'kmaq community, on both my parents' side. I have a stronger connection through my father's side, and his parents were Yvonne Gallant and Wilson Samms, and strongest connection that I have personally is through my grandfather's from Flat Bay. So his grandmother, my Grammy Webb, was Mary Webb from Flat Bay. And Cadre Valley area originally, but she was the last known speaker of our Mi'kmaq language here on the West Coast. Traditional midwife, delivered hundreds of babies on the West Coast, and could speak multiple languages, Gaelic, French, and was just a general healer. So I was lucky enough to grow up with a lot of the teachings and culture and be grounded in my culture, which kind of situated me in my, trajectory, I guess, of an interest in helping others and led me towards nursing. But ultimately, my number one goal has always been to support community, and basically whatever I do is for community and how can we better the community together. So it's kind of directed me into the opportunities that I've been lucky enough to have, sitting on various committees and being part of different organizations in order to have a voice at the table. So that's a little bit about my background.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for that. And this brings us into kind of the crux of your dissertation work, which, as you've said, unites the notions of community and your background as a Mi'kmaq woman. And how did this bring you to the idea of the heart?
So, yeah, that's a good question. Funny enough, it started out, I wasn't looking to start a PhD program right then. It was in the back of my mind, but a colleague had called and asked to have a conversation around cardiovascular health and Indigenous women, and got talking and suggested, maybe you should do your PhD around this. So like most students, I went for what I thought was going to be easiest. I emailed a bunch of people. No one wanted a student at the time. And eventually I was lucky enough to get my supervisor, Margot Jackson at the time. And my dissertation started out around just Indigenous women, very broad, and cardiovascular disease. So when I went on campus for one of my stints, and talking with my supervisor, the more that she asked me the question, like, what are your methods going to be? What's your overall methodology? And, throwing at all these different words, narrative, and is it this type of qualitative research? Nothing really fit. So eventually what happened was I just sat down and had a really good conversation and said, you know, this doesn't fit my understanding and what I'm comfortable with. So we changed my question around a little bit to just be focused on Mi'kmaq women, because that's what I know and I'm comfortable with. And it was a purpose of moving forward for a community. So I had talked to women in the community, and that was something that they were interested in. So it's Mi'kmaq women around the word heart and what it means to them, and hopefully to look at current interventions and why are they not working, and to build on that. So that's kind of how it changed.
You don't mind, Jordan?
Yeah, please.
I'm interested in this, hearts, because, well, let me put it this way. I pick up a book of poetry. Okay? I don't know, here's a book of poetry, right? Odds are I go through this book of poetry, I'm going to find a reference to the heart. Okay? And of course, what the poet means by that is not that thing you study in the anatomy class with the ventricles and the auricles. Atrium. Yeah. Okay. So the heart is constructed as a certain anatomical object. Okay. And so along with that construction of the heart as an anatomical object goes the conception of the heart as something that, you know, has diseases that are peculiar to it. Okay. So I got a clogged artery or something, right? Or I have arrhythmia or something. Okay. And with those diseases of the heart, well, then you get, you know, various kinds of treatments. Okay. I got to give you this drug for your cholesterol. Okay. Whatever. Right. But in the discourse of ordinary human beings in just about any culture, and, you know, as you've already indicated, you know, Mi'kmaq culture is one of those cultures. The word heart is an image for the person. Okay. And funnily enough, or I don't know, not funnily enough, you know, what I get in a preliminary sense from what I know of your research is that metaphorical sense of the heart, it's more than a metaphor, right? Because obviously the heart is embedded in a body, the body is embedded in a community, the community is embedded in an ecology, right? And all of these things play into what the heart does, what state the heart is in, right? So could you say a few words about, I guess, the Mi'kmaq concept of the heart and, you know, how it relates to community ecology and so on and so forth?
Yeah, that's really good points. It's because I'm a Mi'kmaq woman, and my understanding, my teachings were around heart as not just the physical. So that kind of drove that question initially for my research. Because I understand it, you're right, more than just an anatomical aspect. So in our teachings and our understanding, some people believe that the heart is like connected to your spirit. Some people call it soul, maybe, in other words. And this is where language gets really interesting.
Sure.
Because the heart is more than that. And I knew for myself, and I can't really go into my own findings right now because I'm still diving into that. But I knew personally that when you talk about heart, it's family, like you said, it's community, it's my connection, how it makes you feel to the environment, and you know, those other aspects that aren't generally talked about a whole lot in healthcare. Nursing's a little bit different. I find that that's an area probably why I was drawn to it. We talk about the heart of healthcare, being kind and caring, but it's more than that for Mi'kmaq people in general. And I can't speak for everyone. I can only say from my teachings, my understandings.
But so I'm just curious, like in your, I mean, I know you're mostly an educator, right? But you still do some kind of hands-on nursing.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So in your experience, in your observation, well, what is it about the heart that makes it? So, I mean, I'm assuming that part of your research centers on the fact that in certain communities, maybe there are high incidences of cardiovascular disease.
Right.
And I'm going to I'm going to go off on a very slight tangent here, Erica, because I come from a community, Scots in Cape Breton, okay? And they have high rates of diabetes, high rates of cardiovascular disease, high rates of alcohol abuse and substance abuse, and all the trauma that causes for family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And I think there, at least I think from what I know of that community, that there are cultural factors in play there. And one of them, actually, I suspect, is language loss. But for instance, if you don't speak your language, or you have to learn your language as an adult, does that affect the heart?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's something I hope to dive into even more so. I think language is a deep-rooted, maybe understanding the worldview is taught into our language, and a lot of our teachings are associated with the language. So I feel as though language is a deeper understanding and a deeper maybe connection to some of those teachings, but to not have your language doesn't mean you're any less Mi'kmaq, or that you won't be able to understand those worldviews, those deeper connections. And do I think it impacts our overall being and how we feel about ourselves? It can, definitely. I'm not very strong in the language. I only pick up words here and there. But there are people who are trying to revitalize that, and I look up to them because they are the future for kind of keeping the language alive. But language is one part that is, you're right, you mentioned trauma, is interconnected, and we lost our language not because of lack of trying or like wasn't being passed. It was related to colonial processes, which deeply impacts the heart. I mean, when you talk about blood memory and things that are passed down from generation to generation, the heart and the conditions, and we were a very healthy, thriving nation before colonization. So why did we get all these rates of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, stroke? It's related to imposed conditions. I mean, it's all interrelated.
So I suppose the way I would put it together for myself a little bit is, well, sort of kind of Western colonial, quote unquote, allopathic medicine imposes a certain vocabulary, right? It imposes certain concepts, okay? And those concepts are, in a scientific sense, very precise and in a lot of contexts, very useful, right? But if what you're doing in healthcare now is more and more involving the patient in her own care or the patient in his own care, et cetera, right? People don't speak in a technical vocabulary. People don't articulate their problems, right, in a technical vocabulary. People don't articulate their sense of their own health and well-being in a technical vocabulary, okay? So how do you navigate around that? I mean, as a caregiver?
Yeah. So again, nursing is kind of focused in on doing teaching and talking about health in a language that is easy to understand. So avoiding things like TID and these abbreviations, and say you have to take your meds at when you have breakfast, when you have lunch, when you go before you go to bed. So, but it's very turning, you're right, very client-centered, and that's the approach we're trying to take. But if you have all the constructs and the policies and things that are implemented that sometimes don't allow 100% of that client's wishes, that can be very difficult, particularly for myself. So you're right, those colonial things or the westernized approaches are embedded in a lot of the healthcare approaches, and that is one of the reasons why I think that the interventions that are being used right now are not being as effective, or because it's not the way we think, or it's not the way, right? It's not the way that maybe we would approach something. And Indigenous people, like I said, were healthy and thriving. We had our own systems, our own knowledge on health and healing and wellness. And initially, when people came, we worked alongside settlers for a while until that shift occurred where no longer we needed that. We took what we wanted from you. So I'm not saying westernized ways are totally terrible. That's not what I'm saying, but I'm saying we had our own system, our own knowledges, which are just as valuable. And I think this is one area where two-eyed seeing or that approach by Albert Marshall is really important, because value both, right?
For our listeners, could you maybe explain what that term means, two-eyed seeing?
So Albert and Mardina Marshall are Mi'kmaq elders who came up with two-eyed seeing, and it's an approach where they talk about valuing westernized knowledge and Indigenous worldview and knowledge as equal. And one is no more better than the other, as how can we work together to move forward, kind of like how we imagine treaties. We both live here, we're supposed to. That's how the essence of treaties started. We'll both live here together side by side, and we won't harm each other now.
Well,
I argue how that turned out. But,
well, I mean, humans don't have a good track record on that.
Right.
Okay.
So I think the two-eyed seeing approach, can be really beneficial in healthcare.
And just for an example, I happen to know this is, I know this is about a little out of left field, but in Sweden, it's become, as far as I know, kind of uncontroversial to, when somebody goes to the hospital, say, from a remote community, right? And so, yes, they receive quote unquote Western scientific medicine, but of course it's contextualized or presented to the patient frequently in terms of Indigenous Sami concepts, right? So, I mean, the hospitals makes, place for, certain kinds of ritual medicine, traditional to the Sami and so forth, right? And their outcomes from that are good. Right. So, and of course, at the beginning, all these people are saying, well, no, what you're doing here isn't scientific. It's not real medicine. It's quackery. It's this, it's that. But you can't argue with the outcomes.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. So what do we need to do to get similar outcomes here?
Well, I think you just listen and I mean, we've done traditional medicine and practices for hundreds of thousands of years. It's passed down as oral history and traditions. And I'll give sweat lodge for an example.
Okay.
Some people will be totally against a sweat lodge. It can have negative impacts. It can, people can pass out, and it can get too hot, dehydration, and it's not safe. But how does it work for thousands of years and have all these great benefits? And if I'm an individual and I participate in a sweat lodge ceremony and I come out and I tell you, I feel better. My mental health is better. Yeah. Like even my joints feel better. Like this makes me, who is anyone to look at someone and say, that's not right. That's not true.
Yep.
Right. So this knowledge and this information is here. It's about incorporating it in a healthy, equal way.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So Erica, if you were able to do one thing tomorrow in the healthcare system, just make one change tomorrow, what would that change be?
That's a big question. That's like putting me on the spot, really. I'd put someone who's Indigenous in charge. In charge.
There you go. Yeah. Big question, but you gave a big answer. Okay.
I mean, you need change at all levels, and it's okay to get a seat at the table, but you need a voice, and not just at that table, So I think real change is going to come from structurally changing things and changing the whole mind frame of the healthcare system. And that's a big task.
So minimally, I suppose we would want available to any Mi'kmaq patient a liaison of some sort, of cultural liaison, who can say, well, okay, you want to give this patient this surgery or this drug or whatever, right? But you have to, because of the whole mind-body connection, right? You have to present that treatment to the patient in the terms that, well, the patient feels part of the process, the patient feels centered in the process, the patient feels they're not simply an object, it's being, right, you know. So, I mean, do we have people like this in hospitals now, or do we?
I believe, and
Yeah.
I don't want to speak out of turn, but I
Sure.
believe
No,
there
no.
is the patient navigator
Speak
in
out of turn.
in St. John's, Indigenous patient navigator.
Yeah.
I don't believe there is one here,
There's
but
one here.
I do believe it may be in the works. But again, sometimes I call those things Band-Aid solutions.
Sure.
It's great. I'm not saying not to
Yeah.
have a patient navigator, but if
Yeah.
you have a navigator and there's still policies impacting the ability to do a ceremony or something in the hospital, then what is the real change that has to happen? Not saying that we don't need the navigators, right?
Okay. Because I can imagine, you know, I go to a hospital administrator and say, well, a patient maybe wants to burn sweetgrass or something. Okay? And the hospital administrator goes, you can't light a fire in my hospital. The insurance will kill, right? Okay. There's all these structural things in place, right? Like, you know, the fire code or the you know, the insurance company or whatever that's going to tell that hospital administrator, don't you dare light anything on fire, like, and you know, or tobacco or something. Well, you know, tobacco is this taboo thing, right? Is that changing?
I think sometimes, in some cases, it is changing. I mean, people are talking about medicine pouches and they're talking about smudging. I'd love to see more real understanding, because someone can read something, someone can write a policy, but unless you participate or you really understand, because we don't really burn anything. You light it and then you light it, you blow it out, and it's just a smoldering smoke that is produced, and it can be very small. It can be a little minute.
So I don't have to set off a sprinkler system.
I mean, I smudge at home all the time. My alarm has never ever went off. I cook and I set that thing off more than I do a smudge. Like it's the reality and understanding. So working together, I think it's just communication and like, you know.
So you can go to the hospital administrator and say, well, you know, this isn't what you think it is, right? This is not going to set off the sprinklers or, you know, right? And well, if the hospital administrator is an Indigenous person, he or she understands that.
And again, and I have to say that I'm coming from Mi'kmaq lens, so I don't know if all nations smudge. I know that other people use a hulic or a hilic, pardon me. It's the lighting of an oil, so it's different. Their needs are different, so it's understanding each individual, and that not everyone who's Mi'kmaq is culturally connected either. So you know, offering someone, say, like, how do you stay healthy is the question you should be asking. How can I help you in this process of being well? And they may say, we can smudge if you like. Someone may say, oh, I don't smudge. Like they may have a status card. That doesn't mean that you're culturally connected or that you follow that spirituality or that belief in the worldview. Right? So it's about understanding our clients and their needs and stuff like that as well as an individual, like, right?
Except to say that a modern hospital is a vast, complex institution in which the needs of individuals are like frequently difficult to accommodate when they conflict with, you know, policies, procedures, quote unquote, best practices that aren't best practices at all, et cetera, right?
Yeah. But who's created all these policies and best practices?
Yeah, sure.
Because I believe a best practice might be to smudge every single day.
It might be.
Right? Like,
it might help me.
Right. And, you know, like, so, and everyone's quite unique because some people do smudge every day and other people only do it when they feel the need. And some people don't do it at all. Like, but, yeah. Okay.
Jordan, did you have?
Yeah, maybe this brings us to the question of, like the forefront of your work and your written work lately, the question of Indigenous research methodology. And so this is like, to what we're kind of saying, there's there's not one simple solution here. This is a work in progress. And so maybe I could just read from your, like one quote from your paper here and just have you guys both comment on it, if that's okay. So the paper is, and I might say this wrong, pardon me, Msignoogma, an exploration of positionality and identity in Indigenous research. And okay, I'm just going to quote you here. A tenet of Indigenous research methodology is that inquiry must allow for fluidity of positions. This includes fluidity with methodological approach and methods in order to recognize, honor, and celebrate diverse relations, spiritualities, and ceremonies. So could you explain that to us?
Yeah. So when I started out my research, like I said, I was very used to this westernized academic approaches, and that's what I was taught, but it didn't fit with what I knew necessarily. So initially I was using whatever fit. So Indigenous research could be broad, and okay, so my research will be Indigenous research. And then it was community centered, so community-based participatory research. But it had to be grounded in what I knew, and as a researcher, so following Mi'kmaq worldview, which also used story works by Joanne Archibald, because the way that she discusses stories and our responsibility with the stories, because we're oral teachings in our culture, is so important. So all these things were, and I was thinking like, oh my goodness, I'm just fitting it into all these little categories. And I don't like categories and boxes. So as my research is unfolding, I'm looking at the question of, you know, talking about research or Indigenous research. And basically it's a terminology imposed by westernized thought in term, and not necessarily the concept, right? But the language and the words that we use, because when I think of research, I may think of it a little different than someone else. Someone may think of research as I'm going out and watching what the beaver is doing for the next 2 months.
And I think people have a conception of research such that you are at a distance from the thing that you are researching.
Exactly. And I like the work of Sean Wilson and T.L. Smith, I think it is. I might have that mixed up, but Smith for sure. And like talking about, you know, researcher ceremony and the Indigenous methodology. And we're not really post-colonial because colonialism is still occurring, those types of things. And my research is really looking at Mi'kmaq understanding of what is research and how did we conduct research for thousands of years and without all these titles, and we didn't really go and ask like, oh, I wonder why, you know, I don't know, the beaver builds the dam at a 90-degree angle,
as opposed to
it was more of a, I'm going to tell you something and this is what I've noticed. And you take that knowledge and that's part of like the understanding of things that are passed down from creator and things that are shared with us, as opposed to me going out and seeking something or having these big questions that I need the answers for or try to answer. Right. So my question now is more around examining the language, right? Because it all stemmed from the word hurt and what does that mean to someone from the English language, then looking at Mi'kmaq language. And so now it's kind of just examining my thoughts on research. And you're right. And positionality in terms of, I was always taught I should be a distance as the researcher from
so you can be quote unquote objective about
the most
beaver,
ethical approach and but I've learned like I've known my women that are in my research. I've went to them and talked to them and kind of you know, gathered them for my research, and I've allowed them to guide whatever way that they want to talk about this. So it may be in a drawing. Someone said it could be a picture I've received. It could be we're walking down the road. It could be a message in Messenger. It's like all these different ways that we're just communicating and gathering, you know, their stories, and I'm holding them for them until I'm ready to discuss with them, how do you want it shared? Because this is what I think. but what do you think? So it's a different kind of approach, and not everyone's comfortable with it, I don't think.
So yeah, I mean, there's a certain sense in which, Sam was a zoologist, and my thing is beavers. Okay, say I am not. Say I am. In terms of social prestige, in terms of institutional prestige, I'm the guy who understands the beaver. But of course, a lot of what I've discovered about the beaver comes from, talking to people in the woods, right? So like talking to local hunters, right? Talking to people, not only who observe the beaver on a daily basis, right? But have a kind of relationship with the beaver, okay? Well, that kind of immediate practical knowledge of the thing, right, is not the same thing at all as kind of, detached, quote unquote, objective research knowledge, right? A lot of people know about seals because they live off them, okay? A lot of people know about chickens because they raise them, okay? And that's a very different situation. But look, if you're a researcher, especially now, I think the tendency is more and more to acknowledge that local guide who actually showed you where the beavers were, okay? Because you didn't know, okay? And so, I mean, I'm not in biology, but from what I understand, there's a bit more of a willingness to acknowledge the fact that our colonial settler knowledge is built upon other kinds of knowledge, and those kinds of other kinds of knowledge have been kind of traditionally erased. Okay, and so my favorite example of that is those two ships they discovered up in the Arctic, right? They weren't discovered. The Inuit hunters there knew where they were. Right? Yeah. It's like, ask the Inuit, oh yeah, it's over there. Right. Sure, right? Right. So there's that bit of knowledge that's been sitting there for centuries and centuries and centuries, but it's not official institutionalized knowledge. So it's not knowledge at all for a certain kind of researcher, right? So I mean, do you in your own research use storytelling?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Someone said to me one time, we were at a meeting or something, and they said, I have a PhD, so they were a doctor, or whoever. Yeah. And they said, that means less to me than if in my community I'm called elder. Because that has a greater meaning to us, and a deeper hierarchy, really, in that title, rather than being a doctor or having these degrees and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I think storytelling and oral history has for years not been looked at the same way because it hasn't been written, right? And hasn't been something that is acknowledged. So like those ships, they were there, but no one acknowledged the Inuit hunters for knowing that it was there. Just because they said they found it, they've written about it or whatever, they discussed it. They're the ones that found it. Yeah. Right? So I just think it's the way you look at something. Like, I would feel horrible if I talked to someone, I took their information or that knowledge and created something and called it my own. Like, I couldn't live with myself.
Sure.
But there's definitely people who do
can.
It. Right?
People who sleep fine at night.
Right. They totally do.
Yeah.
So I think part of it's just our embedded values, beliefs, teachings, traditions, like they're all interconnected. Like, I can't talk about myself as a nurse alone, because that's not who I am. Like, sure, I'm a mother, like I'm a nurse, I'm also Mi'kmaq, like there's all these different things. So how can you just be a researcher? You're not. You're all these other things that make you who you are to go get these stories or participate in these lives of individuals. So
sure.
Yeah, being purely objective about the subject is just cutting out the subject at the end of the day. You see what I mean?
End of the day.
Exclude that.
Sorry, Jordan, did you have?
Yeah, sure. Maybe if we can kind of head in this direction. So
this is kind of bringing us to the notion of social ecology, which we talked about in our preliminary meeting. So all of these roles that you might play, you know, elder, mother, member of the land, so to speak. So this brings, we've talked about community a bit. Maybe we could talk then about just the complex notion of identity in Indigenous, and in the Indigenous sense, and frankly, like in any sense, really, if we're being like pluralistic. So you guys, would you like to talk about identity? Maybe?
Identity, I think, is the thing I understand least in the world. So maybe Erica should talk about it.
Nice.
Well, that's a big question too. I think identity has been at the forefront for Indigenous people in the last little, because of stolen identity, or
stolen identity,
you know, taken up identities.
But also there's a question of legally constructed identity. So like, are you a member of the Halibu band or are you not?
Right.
That I don't know what the criteria are, but I assume there are.
Right.
I know there's paperwork involved.
Right. So the notion of, you know, identity is very personal, and I can only speak from my own understanding of that. But I was always Mi'kmaq. It didn't matter that I didn't have a status card. Like that didn't make me any less who I was.
Sure. And it shouldn't.
No. And the fight for status was more about equality and the rights of Indigenous people and recognition, and, you know, but the identity construct of being Indian was a colonial thing to control and destroy, you know, our Indigenous peoples.
Sure.
And basically, whether you're using the term Indian status, you're Aboriginal, now it's Indigenous, that's more of the putting all these nations, these unique nations and people into one lump sum and trying to talk about everyone as the same. We're all very unique and different. So to me, each community and nation is holding on to identity by what they describe as their kinship. So the relationship that you have with each other. So number one, you're connected to community. Like, it's not just about, oh, I have 1/8 of a great grandmother who might have been. So
it's not
Indian.
A quote unquote blood matter.
No, to me, like, and some people believe, you know, blood quantity is important. I think it's more so that you've had connection to a community, that you have some of this knowledge and worldview. Some people have been disconnected from community because of colonial travesties, such as the 60s school, residential schools, and they're trying to reconnect. They're different in terms that they've been displaced, reasons not their own. And I think basically they're the ones too that are suffering for identity, right? But the ones that come back and who are genuinely really wanting to do the work and be connected to their community are the ones that really connect and you know.
And so is there a process we have in place now for sorting that out that you think is fair?
And there's these political construct of Halibu. That's only a political entity. That's a band. That's I don't walk around and say I'm Halibu. Like, that's not how I talk.
But for some people, that identity can be,
that's important for someone to, but being raised in the culture, that's not how I was taught. My identity is not connected to a car. My identity is connected to my ancestors, who I am, my teachings.
Your grandmother, the midwife,
right? And who I am personally. So my values that I am responsible to give back to community and what I do, my ethical responsibility to community is almost sometimes higher than my ethical responsibility to academia, because if I hurt community members, like, I can never like go back there. Like, that would impact me, like, and my connection, like, to community. It's tied into that umsignogama, that all my relations, that my relationship is to everything, everything is to me, and my responsibility.
And that's the you started your paper with that concept.
Right.
Can you explain it a little more for our listeners?
Yeah, and this is going back to language, because if you translate in English, it's very loosely all my relations, but it's more than that. It can be a prayer, it's our understanding, it's our worldview tied in, it's all my relations to everything living, non-living, from this physical to the non-physical space.
So it's not just your grandmother, it's also in some sense the land, or
land.
Yeah.
My connection to the land, plants, animals, everything. And basically beyond this world. So, my ancestors walked with me, but I also want to walk on Mother Earth in a good way, so that, when I leave the physical, that I'm leaving in a good space, and that, what I've left here is basically things that my 7 generations can be proud of. So it's not just about us. We always think ahead. So, yeah.
And for you, that's better hearts.
Yeah.
Yes.
100%.
Yep.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the heart is just
in both senses.
Right.
Yeah.
It's tied into our spirit and beyond this world. And I think that things that I've never even considered, that sometimes, like you say, I don't ask and question things. Like my son said one time, Mom, I'm tired of giving hugs. We're at powwow, so you hug everyone. You're hugging, and he's like, I'm tired.
At a certain age, you don't like that.
And he's like, oh, there's so many people. And I'm like, yeah, but that's what we do.
Yeah.
And talking to individuals, they're like, well, yeah, because you're bringing your
kids are
closer.
teenagers, right?
Now,
so they don't want to be hugged by any, not even you.
Yeah, but he was younger, but they were
younger,
bringing the spirit together and connecting
sure.
in that way. And I was like, oh yeah, I never thought of it like that. That makes sense. And that's, you're coming together as two, spiritual beings, and you're taking that moment together, and you're acknowledging is different than a handshake. And like, oh, hey, whatever, you're done.
Sure.
So it's like things that we're taught that later on you have that deeper understanding, and some things you'll never find.
Because at some point he's going to say to himself, my mom was right about hugging, but he may not admit it to your face.
That's right.
Someone.
All right. So how are we for time there, Jordan?
Yeah, this is going pretty well. So maybe I could just say this has been a great conversation, and
thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both. And if there's anything
do you have anything to add?
Sure. Maybe we can kind of, if you guys wanted to close, we could do that. I also was just going to say this question is really interesting. In your paper, again, you say about how we cannot just speak in terms of the universal, like the indigenous. There's just the multiplicity, like a variegated, like hundreds of different communities, even in this country, right?
Yeah.
So, but as this is my Blake quote for the day.
Oh,
the world in a grain of sand, right?
Yes,
this is the tension we're trying to throw out.
Sure. Because the heart's everybody's concern.
Everyone's concerned, no matter what you call it.
Yeah, sure.
Right?
And I think everyone kind of realizes that it's more than a thing that goes thump, 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 because it's mind-body connections and so on, right? So that medicine is not a technique of plumbing that's separate from politics, from history, from culture, from
that's right.
All of these things.
All my relations.
All my relations. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really fabulous. Okay. Anything you guys like to close on?
I'm good.
All good.
You have a closing statement, Erica?
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so. Okay.
Well, this has been great, guys, and thanks again. You've been listening to the Parmenius podcast. Say goodbye, guys.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay.